Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this discussion with the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists about fighting fake news and misinformation. My name is Nicole Poitras. I recently graduated from Emerson College's journalism program, and I am here with Dave Mikkelson, the founder and CEO of the fact-checking website, Snopes.com.
Hello, Nicole.
Hello. So Snopes didn't start out as strictly fact-checking. So I want to start out by talking about how Snopes did start out and what separates Snopes from other fact-checking websites and how it's grown since its beginning.
Yeah, well, it didn't start out as fact-checking as we know it now, although it did kind of start out as verifying things. But yes, it kind of grew out of just my hobby of, discussing urban legends and analyzing them, and in some cases trying to run them to ground. Often with urban legends, kind of whether they're literally true or not is beside the point, and possibly the least interesting aspect of them, rather than why people continue to tell these particular stories and what they say about us and what they mean. But I originally started, intended to be sort of like an encyclopedic reference for urban legends, if you maybe like a Wikipedia for urban legends without the wiki part, of course. And sort of here we are 25 plus years later. It's kind of been a long evolutionary path into what we're doing now, just as the internet has grown and changed in many ways.
Yeah, because you didn't start out, you're not a journalist per se. You started out with computer science, correct?
Correct. I have a computer science degree. I was an IT person. This was just sort of a creative outlet. I was on the internet, long before most people had ever heard of it, because I worked for a very large computer company, sort of an early adopter. And so when the first graphical browser came out, I guess is a good way to put it, I just started writing up some little Disney-related urban legends on the web. And then when I finished with those, I created 3 or 4 other categories, and it just kind of exploded from there, where it quickly became the place where everybody just sent anything questionable they came across on the internet. This was before search engines, even when Yahoo was still hand compiling directories of websites, kind of like a phone book. And the landscape was very different then. Of course, there was the internet was much smaller. It seemed like it took a surprisingly long time before spammers figured out how to manipulate email. It took a surprisingly long time before politics subsumed the internet. But initially, we were dealing with a lot of things that we never see anymore, really, about computer virus warnings, many of which were hoaxes, and please to help find missing children, many of which were hoaxes or misunderstandings. Now, all of that stuff's handled by Symantec or McAfee have websites, and there's a National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and those kinds of things just don't show up on email and social media anymore. But on the other hand, politics is kind of like taken over everything all day long, every day.
Yeah, and so now that Snopes is kind of like the top website for fact checking and what a lot of people use to fact check, especially political news and information, what is your process for fact checking information?
Well, of course, I suppose it all starts with topic selection. In general, our philosophy has always been that we just tackle whatever the most people are asking us about or questioning or interested in at any given time, that we don't make any subjective judgments about this is too silly or frivolous or obvious or not important. We figure this is what most people are asking about, there's a reason. It often gives you a kind of disappointing view into human nature sometimes, where you can see something like what should be an important story, like who knows, a chemical attack against civilians in Syria, and there's a lot of doubt about whether it actually happened and who was really responsible for it, and multiple sides are blaming each other. That's a story of real world importance. That's literally a matter of life and death to people. Very little interest here, but a fake photo of President Trump, with his pants down or something, that's going to get 5 million views, and that's what everybody's asking about. So, but it was a lot easier in in the pre-social media days, when most of the items we tackled were things that were being spread by email forwards. We just looked at what people were emailing us and also say what they were searching our site for, and those were pretty much all the input we needed. Now there's just so many inputs and metrics about what's in email, what's people posting to our Facebook groups, what are people posting on Facebook generally, what are people tweeting about, what are people searching for on Google, what's trending on Reddit. It's a lot harder to try and synthesize all those inputs into this is what we should deal with today. It's another evolving process.
Absolutely. You talked a bit about social media, and we're facing a lot of misinformation and disinformation right now, especially on social media. What do you think has led to the rise of misinformation and disinformation right now?
Well, we could spend several hours on that. Of course, well, I say sometimes, when the sort of the internet first started to take hold, something you frequently heard touted about the internet was how liberating it would be, because in many cases it would say eliminate middlemen. Like if you wanted to buy airline tickets, you didn't have to go through a travel agent anymore. You could just go to the airline's website, or you could buy and sell stocks without having to use a broker. Or if you were a musician, you could sell your music directly to your fans without having to have an onerous contract with a record label. I don't recall there being very much talk back then about maybe in some spheres having those gatekeepers or those middlemen is a good idea, like in the field of journalism, that maybe we really do need trained professionals to kind of determine what is news and how do you reliably gather and report news rather than it being a free-for-all. But that's what we have now is like, lots of, everyone from individuals to groups who don't really or shouldn't really qualify as journalists are out there competing with New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. It gets even worse with social media because now everything's kind of divorced from brand, right? It's not like social media isn't like the equivalent of, say, picking up a copy of Time magazine and reading it, cover to cover. It's more like going to a newsstand and the proprietor hands you 40 different articles torn from the pages of 40 different magazines, and you have no idea where they came from or why he gave them to you. Well, that's social media. All your friends and your relatives and your coworkers and even strangers are determining what articles you see based on what they share and what you previously read. So it kind of leveled the playing field in a way that isn't particularly good for consumers of news. So here we are, and also just sort of the nature of the internet. Before, if something outrageous happened to someone, or even they just made up a story about something outrageous that didn't really happen to them, but they're claiming it, where would that go? 20 years ago, you could tell your neighbors, you could tell your friends. If you were really aggrieved, maybe you could write a letter to the editor of your local paper, and that's where it would stop. But now, people post stuff to social media, and half an hour later, it's a headline in the Daily Mail or the New York Post. And now all the news media have to deal with it. So it is very challenging, and it has not yet evolved for the better. At least the pendulum is still swung on, onto the bad side for the time being.
Absolutely. For people who, what steps can news consumers take when they're online on social media, to kind of like take a second and stop, and before they go and share something, before they know whether or not it's true.
Yeah, well, as much as I dislike saying it, a lot of stuff, a lot of simple steps are quite obvious, but people don't take them. One is sort of like making sure you know what the source of what you're reading is. I said that seems kind of obvious, but a lot of people don't necessarily look at where's this from, and even if you've identified that, this is the age of news aggregating. So often you'll be reading an article, even if it's from something that's fairly reputable, and you'll see that, well, it's basically a rewriting of this article that appeared on another site who borrowed it from yet a third site who did a rewrite of something that was on a fourth site, and you're 5 or 6 steps down the chain, and it's like a game of telephone. So you kind of need to, as much as you can, look at what you're reading and see, what to what extent is this original reporting? What are their sources? Are they just passing along something that they gleaned from somewhere else? Another big hangup is people getting caught reading things that are several years old and not realizing that this is not happening anymore. This is not a current issue. When it gets to extremes, we find the same celebrities dying, multiple times over, years apart, because people recirculate obituaries and only look at the month and the day and not the year. But those are very simple steps. Another one that sounds kind of obvious, but unfortunately it's not to many people, is that recognizing the difference between fact and opinion. Is what you're reading reporting something to you that is factual, and are they telling you where they got it, or are they just expressing a viewpoint about something that may or may not have happened, depending on their sources. And then again, there's in the larger sphere, there are a number of entities out there that rate the reliability and the political leanings of a lot of the major websites out there. They're not hard to find. Of course, there are always fact-checking sites. If there's something in particular you're uncertain about, you can check out a specific item.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny you say that, because a couple months ago, I almost stumbled into that problem where I saw this article. I forget what it was, but I was like, oh my gosh, this happened. And then I looked and it was like from 2 years ago. And I was like, what? Why is this circulating in my news feed? It's,
it's gotten to the point that some of the, some of the responsible news outlets out there have caught on that when something old of theirs is being recirculated heavily for whatever reason, that they will put a banner up at the top, advising readers, this article is from 2007 or something like that, to try and help keep people from falling into that pit.
Yeah, and you mentioned algorithms as well, and how social media uses that.
Yeah.
I think it's important for consumers and social media users to understand how algorithms work as well, because we've talked even in my classes, we've talked about how algorithms and that sort of thing can kind of cause people to only see news from certain sources or be caught in kind of an echo chamber.
Right, the echo chamber, or filter bubble, or whatever term we want to call it, where yes, social media and other kinds of sites are they're following, they know what you share, they know what you read, they know how much time you're spending reading different kinds of articles. They kind of know what sort of subjects you favor and read most often, and so they're geared to optimize that. I mean, it isn't necessarily malevolence, but their business is to get as many eyes on their platform as possible and to keep them there as long as possible. So when they determine what engages you, they will keep feeding you more of that. And it's kind of akin to, I guess, if you were really a golf nut, you could probably find a way to watch golf 24 hours a day on television. There are enough cable channels out there that specialize that you could do that if you wanted, but it's really kind of hard to convince a person like that, it's not good to watch just golf all the time. You really need to watch some other sports. So it's kind of an uphill battle to try and convince people you need to stop reading this stuff that you like and you agree with, and really start reading more stuff that you don't agree with and you don't like, because you're getting a very one-sided view of things. But as I often say, technology changes quite rapidly, human nature not so much.
Yeah, for sure. So the past 4 years especially have been a very busy time for fact checking.
Yes.
Do you expect misinformation and disinformation to slow down now that we have a different administration?
Well, one would hope, although I'd say it's probably just going to change more in form than in quantity. We're kind of I think we're at a bit of a crossroads here where finally the social media platforms have really started to crack down on, the worst offenders and beyond. And, I don't give myself credit for being terribly foresightful, but, I think we're kind of, reaching a critical mass here where there's a lot of disenfranchised voices, validly or not, they're all out there, and they're not just going to stay quiet, they're going to go somewhere. So what's going to be the next thing? I mean, we've seen things like Parler, with an E, that kind of popped up and then flared out quite spectacularly and may be resurrected, or now like we see like Clubhouse for audio chat. Something is going to come along and replace or give voice to all of these let's just say disgruntled speakers. And I don't know exactly where it's going to go next, but somewhere. It's also kind of the approach to misinformation is always changing. Of course, how to combat it, well, that's been a subject of intense interest, in academic study the last several years for obvious reasons. And of course, there are no definitive answers, but I'd say it's fair that, a number of studies have suggested that approaching misinformation by basically telling people they're wrong and shoving fact checks at them is not a particularly good or even an effective approach. So, in terms of what we do, I'd say, we categorize it as sort of like the scientific phrase, necessary but not sufficient, right? That fact checking alone is not going to change the world, but for people to change the world, they do need to have reliable access to facts. So that's the portion that we occupy. But there's so much more that needs to be done, again, with everything from media literacy to actually changing hearts and minds and everything in between.
Yeah, being able to have those conversations about what's true and maybe what's not.
Yes. Like I said, there's lots of study been done and is ongoing about how to approach people, how to present information, even even just how to structure information within a fact check, like the inverted pyramid of telling people what's not true first and only repeating the rumor you're addressing that's false, until they're well into the article. That's it gets that granular. So there's a lot more work to be done there.
Absolutely. How do you feel journalists can be better fact checkers in the process of reporting? Our job is to get the facts and everything, but how can we even be better than we already are at making sure we're getting it right? Do you?
Well, of course, one of the issues, and not necessarily about you and your colleagues, but this isn't a new phenomenon. And even way back 25 years ago, we were often seeing that news outlets, particularly local ones, would often publish articles uncritically, like an example, we get lots of crime warnings, watch out for this form of crime. If someone leaves a water bottle on your car, that's a sign that sex traffickers are, plotting to abduct you. And it's just, there's no truth to that. It's people putting random events together with no causal connection between them. But often, people would report that to someone. It would get written up in a newspaper, and the reporter wouldn't even think to, like, say, contact the police. Are there any known instances of this form of crime? Much less is it commonplace. So, there were times it was unfortunate that reporters weren't doing their jobs very well. But I don't mean to suggest by any means that's that applies to anything other than a minority. I don't know. It's hard to say, as I can't say that I've really seen, most reporters for reputable news outlets, doing poor jobs. It's unfortunate. I would say that at least in where national news is concerned, that so much of it is just heavily dependent on sources who can't be identified publicly, which also sort of makes it immune to fact checking when you can't question the same sources that someone else is using. I mean, that's kind of one of the standards of fact checking, is that you're supposed to, provide your sources, provide enough information that someone else could replicate your fact check, and verify it. And again, we're always seeing people who are speaking on condition of anonymity because they're not authorized to speak, publicly. Sometimes that backfires, but again, it's kind of difficult to do journalism without it. Larger scale, but so I don't think, by any means, most journalists have been doing poor jobs lately. I think they're, to some extent, it may even be that we've gone a little bit to the other extreme, where we become maybe in some cases hyper skeptical of things that don't really need to be questioned. And then, people discounting things just on some minor basis that, really aren't questionable.
What do you mean by hyperskeptical?
Well, I said, people, maybe not so much the reporters, but rather than the audience, reading something and not accepting it just because they've become so hyper skeptical that they're not going to believe it unless it has some extreme level of documentation or proof attached to it. I know, sort of like, I'm sure you're used to, it's quite common when you're writing articles that you will contact someone who is an expert in the field of whatever you're addressing, and ask them some questions, ask them for comment, ask them if they have anything they want to contribute. But if you're writing an article and you mention in passing that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa, you don't need to contact someone at Caltech to get him to verify that fact for you. I mean, that's kind of going beyond the pale into the land of the obvious. But certainly some readers are now reacting to news that way, where if not every single thing is footnoted, they're not going to believe it. And that's not as bad as the problem in the opposite direction, but it's still a problem.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't seen that problem before.
Yeah, well, and especially now, I mean, we've just gone through 4 years of the President of the United States disclaiming pretty much every news organization that isn't, slanted to the far right as being fake news and unreliable, which means, they're sort of, any hope they have of perhaps winning back the trust people who might now be considering them skeptically means that they have to be even more vigilant, and those people are going to be looking at them even more critically than really they need to. But that's the position we're in now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky to navigate.
Yeah.
Earlier, you were talking about the kind of crackdown that social media has been doing on misinformation and going
Mhm.
so far as to banning accounts, as they did with
Mhm.
President Trump, former President Trump. And the common argument that I've seen against that is First Amendment. And it doesn't have control over or any impact over private companies or anything, but do you think there's any kind of line about yes, free speech, and no, the First Amendment doesn't cover private companies, but I don't know, is there not
Ye-
much censorship, but is
Yeah,
there?
well, it is, because it's in some ways it's almost seemingly an intractable issue. I mean, of course, as with many things, it's very easy to start with the extremes, right? Where it's very easy for a platform to say, Holocaust deniers, they no longer have a place on our platform. If that's what you're going to put on our platform, then we're banning you. That's kind of where do you go from there? I mean, there are a lot of, let's say there are a lot of varieties of truth. I mean, what do you do with, say, news publications, some really far out or slanted ones that 8 times out of 10, their articles are factually wrong, but 2 times out of 10, they're not? Do you just ban them blanketly? And you can have instances where information that's being reported can be 100% accurate and still egregiously misleading. Like if you only present one side of an issue. Imagine if you were, say, on trial, accused of a crime, and only the prosecution got to present their case, and you didn't get to rebut anything they said or present any evidence of your own. It's not the prosecution made up a false case against you, but you would have a hard time, disproving it without being able to say anything in your own defense. Well, so if someone's presenting just one side of a story, it can, be, as I said, 100% accurate, but readers are going to come away with a very misleading and distorted perception. What do you do about that? I mean, you try and ban them and say, but you haven't pointed to anything I've said that wasn't true. So, and it does run into First Amendment issues among, a lot of other considerations. How do you start cracking down on that without running afoul of our, sort of cherished right to free speech? And I have to say that I recognize it's a difficult problem to wrestle with, but I have to say that social media platforms have not been dealing with it very well. They have not been putting out very consistent, well-organized standards and, consistently applying them. It seems to be right now, it's just an ad hoc process, which is when, we're getting so much, public opprobrium that we have to do something about this. We'll ban somebody, and then we'll make up afterwards a reason. We'll create some standards, retroactively that they verified that they violated to justify this. And again, even our experience working with Facebook, which we famously stopped doing. Again, and it's like, well, you have the issue of, do you treat all material as equal, which is kind of what they're doing now, as in, okay, they'll flag an article as false because it's spreading misinformation about COVID vaccinations. That's very dangerous, potentially life-threatening. But then you see somebody, took a picture, a photograph of a hillside, and they artificially colored it and added in flowers, and now it's getting flagged on Facebook as a fake photo. Well, is anyone really being harmed by this? Do we really need to be, flagging this and penalizing people for sharing it? No, but right now it's still kind of like, one size fits all. If it's false, it's false. It doesn't matter what it's about or its relative importance. So, Again, a lot of work to be done by the social media platforms and how they're dealing with this problem.
Yeah, and it seemed like they kind of only started doing it, like you said, because the public was saying, "Hey, we need more accountability here."
Yes. Well, yeah. Of course, it's the continuing issue where you can't, well, certainly legally for the time being, hold the social media platforms accountable because
Mhm.
we have the famous Section 230 that President Trump kept, espousing that he wanted to do away with, that they're just platforms, they're not themselves the publishers, although, the lines, are blurring all the time. And if you're actively moderating content, where is that line? So, but as we've seen, kind of with the large scale misinformation, say around the recent election, where, now we're seeing the actual harm done, just, say like companies like Smartmatic and Dominion, where they're starting to go after people for defamation and, libel with libel suits. And, perhaps that will change the landscape some. Depends, fortunately, like all litigation, it can take so much time and money to to pursue those things to the end, even when you're absolutely in the right. And when you're going after, big news corporations with, that are multi-billion-dollar corporations, it's tough for a plaintiff to outlast them. But, we can hope some permanent change is affected by those.
Yeah, speaking of lawsuits, we have some questions from the audience, and if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat. But what do you think about the lawsuit filed by Dominion? Could that have an impact on organizations that spread false information?
Well, so, yeah, as I was just discussing, I would hope so. I was kind of more familiar with the one filed by Smartmatic because I actually, read that one all the way through and wrote about it briefly. But they all seem, I mean, given the caveat that I am not a lawyer, of course, they seem pretty strong to me, and that's the opinion of other people who actually are lawyers. I mean, we were ground zero for all of this, following all these baseless claims. And you see, it really puzzles the audience, even if they're trying to keep up responsibly, because what do we keep seeing these, articles and talking heads going on about, oh, we have hundreds of affidavits and all these people wouldn't, make sworn affidavits under penalty of perjury, if what they were saying wasn't true. But the problem is, they weren't showing us the actual affidavits. You really kind of had to do some hunting online if you really wanted to track them down and read them. And when you actually do read them, you see that it's just people reporting not actual evidence of any voter fraud. It's people just repeating hearsay, third-hand hearsay. They're repeating their opinions. They're talking about things that are completely irrelevant or of no import. So yeah, maybe they weren't lying, maybe they were telling the truth, but all these affidavits are absolutely useless. And in fact, they were continually rejected by courts as having no value. So again, in some ways that's a flaw of reporting, not a flaw of responsible reporting, but certainly a flaw in the bad reporting that would tout these things without presenting the other side that as legal evidence these things are worthless pretty much. Just want to play up that there's hundreds of affidavits out there. There must be something. We kind of see that news cycle trick now where sort of disreputable organizations just float completely unsubstantiated rumors out there, and then let it build a critical mass and say, well, this needs to be looked into because there's so many rumors out there about this. I mean, it's sort of the snake eating its own tail kind of a thing, where they're creating the false information and then demanding that it be looked into. So like I said, we can hope some of the more egregious examples, that are now being pursued legally might have an effect on that. Was it the Seth Rich story, about the young man who worked for the DNC and was killed, and Fox News, among others, kept promulgating for a long time this conspiracy theory that he had leaked emails from the DNC, to WikiLeaks, and a lot of material that was relevant to the 2016 election and helping to defeat Hillary Clinton. And as the police have been saying from day one, it just appeared to be a random murder or a robbery murder, and traumatized his family. And news outlets on the right kept running with this, and Fox News was sued over it, and they eventually settled, but of course didn't allow that to come out until after the election was over. And of course it had to be settled rather than pursued to a verdict, because I'm sure the family just didn't have the means to outlast Fox in court. But so litigation as a means of fixing the misinformation problem is unfortunately too cumbersome and time consuming and expensive, to get at the heart of the matter. So it's left to us, in the journalism field to try and make those inroads.
Absolutely. Going back to social media for a second, do you foresee any kind of government regulation of social media platforms, the use of algorithms to curb the spread of misinformation in the future?
I could see that happening, although probably in, like in an ancillary sense. Certainly there may be a push to break up some of the behemoth social media platforms, which, because they, as with any industry, what we see is consolidation on a mass scale. And so you have one or two big entities that end up buying up everyone else and every idea. So there may be an effort to break those up. There may be certainly efforts to, if not eliminate, then strongly regulate kind of what drives those algorithms, that the social media platforms is, as we frequently say, what is their product? Their product is you, or more specifically, their product is personal information about you and your habits, because that's what they make money from selling to advertisers. And so there may be some governmental efforts to, curtail or severely limit how much social media platforms can collect and share about you. And that drives a lot of the misinformation, because a lot of it is very skillfully targeted to receptive audiences, right? Whether it's just plain old, whether it's news, I'll use that term in scare quotes, news, or advertising, or even the worst case political advertising, where they're very specifically going after the most receptive, vulnerable audiences that they can find. And they can do that kind of precise targeting in a platform like Facebook, where I want to target 24 to 40-year-old white males in Louisiana who have visited gun sites or something like that. That's so again, it's a large part of what feeds into those echo chambers, and filter bubbles, where people are just getting more and more of what they're already seeing and what they want to believe, and no contrasting views. So if there's any progress there, I imagine it will come from that step. I don't see that, barring something major like the government repealing Section 230 and just opening up social media platforms to being sued right and left, I don't know what the government can or will do much beyond that. I mean, of course, there's always the problem again with the First Amendment. Right now, the social media platforms can get away with banning users and banning organizations but because they're private entities. But, if they're doing that in government direction or government regulation, then that, becomes a First Amendment issue and very thorny to navigate.
Mm. Yeah. Switching gears a little bit back to more fact checking in general, just looking at some questions from the audience. As a pioneer in the fact checking business, how do you feel about other fact checking organizations that have started up since Snopes began? Is there competition among fact checking sites?
I suppose there's competition in the site that, we're all in the same industry, and, a lot of the material we're covering is in common. I don't know, it's not really so much of a business competition. We're kind of unique in this space in that we're neither an arm of a much larger and older news organization like Associated Press or Washington Post, nor are we a nonprofit. We just are and always have been in independent, unaffiliated business, for-profit business, that is to say. So we're sort of really a different breed than the rest. But in some ways it's good and bad. They say it's bad and kind of like economies of scale, right? If you've got 10 different fact-checking organizations, it would be kind of better in a broad sense if they weren't covering overlapping material. We'd have 10 times as many fact checks. That would benefit everyone. But on the other hand, you don't really want a whole lot of collaboration. I mean, what you want is, if you're going to have trust in a fact check, you're going to trust it more if you're seeing 10 separate organizations fact checking the same thing and all coming to the same conclusion, right? Because there may be times when maybe 5 of them would say one thing and 5 would say another. I would hope not, but if they do, that's kind of a clue that something's up. Then maybe this issue isn't as easily verifiable as one might think. But so it's it has benefits and disadvantages, but again, it's not like there haven't been fact checking is just really an offshoot, a niche of journalism. There's been a multiplicity of news outlets for centuries. They serve different audiences. They may be national, they may be global, they may be local, they focus on different things. In general, having more of them is better than having fewer of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the fate of the fact-checking business in general, now that we're hopefully moving away from an alternative fact world?
Can hope. Well, for us specifically, remember, we didn't start out here. I mean, most of the other fact-checking organizations started out where we were today, where we are today. I said we started out very different. I was writing about urban legends and things that are not fact-checked so much. And in some sense kind of miss those days. And it would be nice to actually get a break where we're not covering having to cover politics all day, every day, and can, get back to just looking into things that are interesting or fun and, not of real world import on a very large scale. So, that would be nice. Other than that, I don't think we're in danger of running out of misinformation anytime soon. And again, we don't, the problem is that we don't, we're kind of now sort of inured to seeing all of this as, this is malevolent, this is fake news, this is deliberate. Well, we've been dealing with a lot of that over the last several years, but there's still plenty of stuff out there that's not of malintent. There's, even I said, back in the early days when we started doing this, just a lot of misinformation gets out there just from people just in good faith misunderstanding something, seeing something that they believe to be true and passing it along to be helpful. They're not they're not deliberately trying to work the world of alternative facts. But it's always out there. And it changes in form, changes in emphasis, but it's not going away. We're not going to be out of a job anytime soon.
It's always going to be the need for verification.
Yes. Yeah, an example, I mean, a simple example was I was just working on the other day on one that's a very, kind of like what we used to do in the olden days. It was, a claim that, President Harding gambled away, all the White House china on a hand of poker. And, it's not that it's completely untrue, necessarily, but, certainly over the years, that story has, kind of taken a particular form and been, crystallized as fact when it's all kind of comes from a single source who reported it in the 1960s and, seemed to have been more like, it was kind of just like a friendly gift he made to someone, after they were playing a game of cards and, it was a little bit of White House china, not the entirety of the presidential dinnerware and all that. But there's just a lot of things again of no real consequence that we come across every day where a narrative from years past has become sort of cemented as this interesting story that people want to believe, because everybody knows, right? That's the image of President Harding. He was just corrupt. Everything about his administration was scandalous. So this story needs to reflect that. And well, it wasn't quite that way, but there's still a lot of our history always reflects what we want to believe and what we want to say, and there's still a lot of unpacking to do with that, as we're seeing every day. You would like say, like, even on something as ambitious like, the 1619 project. I hope I got that year right. But, there's just, and, all the recent issues with, say, like Confederate monuments and finding out, these things have nothing to do with, preserving Civil War history from the 19th century. They were put up in the 1950s as kind of a challenge to the civil rights movement. That we have a lot to deal with that's been out there for a very long time.
Yeah, and here's a fun question. What's the most outlandish thing you've had to debunk in this age of false information?
Yeah, that's a not uncommon question, and the problem is most of them are not something you would repeat in polite company. But I'll give an example of one that's really from the very early days of the site. I would say pre-internet days, but obviously it can't be because I was writing about it on the internet. But I'll just say back in the days when it was very difficult to chase down stories by using the internet rather than actually using print sources and talking to people. But even the pre-internet days, kind of, we used to have what was called Xerox lore, or fax lore, right, where people would spread things by, faxing them to each other or just photocopying them and putting them up on bulletin boards. That was like the early internet, and there was this text that used to circulate that purported to be an article from a medical journal about, I'm going to give you a warning about this one, about, it was, a case study of a man who had presented to a doctor with his scrotum very swollen and infected and blue. And, the doctor, had to, debride it and sort of sanitize it and sew it back together, and discovered staples in there. Because it turned out that what the patient told him was that he worked, eventually the patient told him that he worked in a machine shop. Sometimes during lunch breaks when no one was around, he would pleasure himself with a belt sander, and he got himself caught in it, and it ripped open his scrotum, and he was embarrassed to tell anyone, and he just kind of stapled it shut. until it got too infected and painful to ignore. And anyways, this was on, bulletin boards all over the world. The internet came along, people were circulating it by emailing it, and it's like, was this a real medical journal article? So it did have some identifying information on it. So I went back and I went to the research library at UCLA because I lived in the Los Angeles area at the time, and tracked down the old medical journal and found out, yes, this really was a case study and printed in a medical journal. But then the next step is, was this article on the level? Just because it was in a medical journal, sometimes like the British Medical Journal is famous for once a year printing like kind of, jokey hoax articles. So it's like how to track this down. I had a doctor's name, I had a part of the world, part of the country he lived in, went to the library where in the olden days, they had phone directories from all over the country, found someone of similar name in the right area, copied down his address, sent him a letter in actual mail. And, eventually I got a letter back from him who he said, yes, this really was a case that he dealt with. And, he provided some additional information about it to verify it. And, he said that, yeah, this article of his was, as said, on bulletin boards all over the world. His son-in-law or someone had encountered it in the Philippines, it kind of plays into two things. One is that, we've learned that there is nothing out there too bizarre that you can just, immediately dismiss it as being false without at least making some attempt to look into it. And as I said at the outset, it kind of illustrates technology changes, human nature not so much. We're still circulating and sharing the same things and kind of in the same way. We're just doing it, technologically differently, right? Social media is the fax machine and bulletin board of days past.
There you go. Wow. That's a wild story. So you said, wow, got a comment in the audience. You said fact checking is necessary, but not sufficient. What else should journalists and organizations do to stop the spread of misinformation?
Well, because when I was talking about that, it's, again, a lot of that has to do with, say, approach, not so much, about journalism and fact checking, but, how to approach people. Again, as I said, shoving, telling them they're wrong and shoving the fact check at them, not often, people are not often receptive to that and don't take it very well. It's sort of perfecting the social techniques of, leading people to maybe, look into things for themselves, like, rather than saying you're wrong, read this fact check from Snopes, saying, oh, that's an interesting subject, but I kind of, read something that seems to be the opposite of what you sent me. Have you seen this? Or, just, the technique of, as they say, polite, persistent questioning, and, asking someone, questions to kind of lead them to think about what it is that they're telling you about or believing. Like, how do you know this? And if this were true, wouldn't it also be true that this other thing would be happening? And, sort of like, giving chance of people to recognize, maybe they've gotten something wrong on their own, and, kind of deal with correcting themselves, on their own, rather than, sort of publicly blasting them, just deal with them one-on-one and leave it to them to say, maybe point out to their friends on social media, oops, this thing I sent y'all, I kind of got that wrong. But I mean, there's been a lot of study gone into that. I'm not steeped in sociology, but I said, a lot of it is more just approach, sort of, it's not about the water, it's about leading the horse to it. The water issue is another, which represents journalism in this metaphor, is something different about, just continuing to make sure that we, present things timely and reliably and accurately, kind of our job. And also, again, there's a larger issue of just everything that we're doing. It's kind of like, again, the world is changing. We've gone from, news, being a, half hour or hour, in the evening on television, 5 days a week, to news is 24 by 7, cable news channels, all the time. News is, not a daily newspaper. It's, it's a, continuous operation online. People aren't consuming things as print anymore, or, not completely, but I mean, there's a lot, dependency on print is much lessened now. People consume information via video much more. Podcasts have, sort of arisen, to fill, some of what, say, like radio used to do in the olden days. So kind of the forms by which people are consuming information are very different these days. Also, demands on people's time and attention. You are competing with a whole lot more, so many more entertainments out there, just other than news, and you have to be able to figure out a way to grab people's attention and get it quickly, and not depend on, necessarily being able to hold it for a long enough time for them to read, a multi-page article, rather than having to feed them everything important in the first 2 paragraphs. I'm sure everyone out there who deals in journalism is familiar with all of this. I'm not telling you anything new, but just all of us have experienced the kind of the form and the format in which we present stuff to our audience is, again, very rapidly evolving, and we have to keep on top of it.
Absolutely. I think we're getting to the end of our hour, so I think this is going to be the last question of the night. But one of our audience members wants to know, where did the name Snopes originate from?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, it's because just today something you were writing about was there a couple of news hosts who'd criticized Ted Cruz because he made a reference to, sound and fury signifying nothing, and saying that, that it was, from Shakespeare, and a couple of people, who should know better leapt in to correct him and say, no, that's from Faulkner. And of course, well, William Faulkner borrowed, the title, The Sound and the Fury, from Shakespeare. Ted Cruz wasn't wrong at all, but that's particularly apt subject for us because Snopes, the name comes from a family of characters who appear throughout the works of William Faulkner. That said, it has really no relevance to the what we do, other than just in the very early days of the internet, when I was posting to it, much as people post to social media now. It's like, well, there's 40 million Davids out there. Who's going to remember another one? I need kind of like a nom de net. And just being familiar with Faulkner, I thought, Snopes, that's, I'll use that. It's an interesting name. It kind of turned out to be rather serendipitous, because now it's kind of like, say, Amazon and Google, right? Those names are short, they're memorable, they have absolutely nothing to do with the underlying service, but in a way that's a benefit, at least for us, because everyone else, sort of in our niche is, fact something or something check or some combination of those words. And we're the one who's not any of those things. So it's easy to remember it. People often mispronounce it like Snoops or something like that. It has nothing to do with snooping or anything like that. It just came out of Faulkner.
Yeah, that's such a cool origin story.
Yes. I mean, literally, it was the name of my cat originally.
Oh. Well, it's 8 o'clock, and I want to thank you so much for being here tonight and having this really awesome and interesting conversation with me. And I want to thank everybody for coming to this SPJ New England event.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.